Now, next up, what I want to do is take some time to interview Juan Benet. Juan Benet is one of the founders and the founder of Protocol Labs, which you may know is the company and the organization behind Filecoin and IPFS. We're going to talk about a lot of things. So without further ado, let's welcome Juan on stage. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here.
You've been a regular at a lot of our events, which is exciting because you have so much context about how everything is going. So what I want to do for today is talk about a handful of things. We're going to talk about all the things that you're seeing are interesting. Let's talk about how do we do things about startups. Let's cover all the things that you are potentially.
Kartik, tell us, what are the most interesting problems that you've seen solved in the last couple of years?
Fuck. I thought I was interviewing you. All right, we'll get there. Okay. One of the interesting things, at least from my perspective, is that having been down this for the last 6 years, I get to see what the progress is on the developer side. The most obvious thing I would say is we have seen DevTools just get infinitely better. I remember 4 years ago, you would spend half the time at a hackathon just getting set up. And now you can click on a repo and it just magically works. Not just for basic dApps. I think the best part is, I think we just kind of saw with a lot of our partners, we're actually making hard things easy too. Like ZK proofs are getting simpler. I don't have to know effectively what is happening behind the scenes. If I can just remember the guy in pickle costume, I get to write stuff in TypeScript. So I count that as a win. Obviously, a big thing is scalability. From just seeing everything getting clogged from the launch of CryptoKitties to where we are now with all these L2s, everybody deploying on OP Stack. I think we've definitely gone to a few thousand transactions per second. Visa is somewhere between 8,000 and 50, I believe. And so that's going well. And I would say largely the other thing will be overall, it is a lot more normal to say that things are on-chain these days. Whether it's the convenience or whether you want to call it UX or just how cheap it is, I think on-chain is becoming common. What do you think?
Great job. What do I think? So I think we solved a bunch of super interesting problems. From my view, the entire space has managed to build in the last few years an entire financial infrastructure that is self-standing, using cryptoeconomic incentives to now do much more financial processing than the traditional wire network, than the European wire network, and so on. And we can now do microtransactions and local payments and microloans and so on. And so we have stood up basically a decentralized financial infrastructure for the world that nobody owns. And it's a big.
That's a win.
Yeah.
That's a progress. Well,
now I think that where we haven't done as well is in consumer applications, right? So when you think about the applications that you use on a day-to-day basis, how many of the applications you're using today in your daily life are fully Web3 powered? Like probably very few, right? So when you think about communication tools like chat or messaging or things like Discord, when you think about forums or even the tools that we use to produce our software like GitHub and so on, like how this entire conversation is going to end up in a video platform. That video platform is centralized and so on, likely. So from a consumer standpoint, in our day-to-day lives, most of our products haven't yet moved over to Web3. And so that's where I think we need to go next, which is like we spent the last few years building this really solid infrastructure and financial system. Now we have to bridge it over to consumer applications so we can get most of the applications on the internet actually using the Web3 primitives and have like the right structure.
Okay, that's interesting. So that in a way, okay, do you think that contradicts the common statement that blockchains are not databases? Here you're saying everything should be more on chain. Is that the same interpretation or?
Yeah, I think so. So I think blockchains are databases, but they're databases that have this strong set of decentralization guarantees about them. Nobody should control them. You should have public verifiability to how you can get something included in the chain, who gets rights to change what part of the database. And so they're not, like traditional database that whoever the admins are get to rewrite all the stuff. It's instead a public shared database. Now, unfortunately, the blockchains so far have been built under extremely tight scalability constraints. We're finally starting to open up the bottleneck, but it's nowhere close to being able to deal with the scale of use that modern consumer applications require, right? So think of something like Twitter or YouTube, and think of being able to process all of the operations and something like that. Think of being able to build a social network entirely on top of these Web3 systems. Like, that's where we're headed.
But does that mean you're saying the scalability solutions we have are just not sufficient, or they are not solving the same or addressing the same problem?
Yeah, not sufficient. So I think maybe a little bit of both. There are some problems that the current scalability structures don't quite get you there. Like many of you builders are going to try today and tomorrow, your hacks will end up invariably needing a bunch of centralized infrastructure providers in order to pull off the kinds of programs that you want to build. And at every moment there, I think like, oh, damn, like this is still Web 2. Now you have to think about how do you move that into Web 3? And that's kind of the missing set of pieces. So some of it is, think of like the backend services and backend data processing pipelines and so on. We need to build infrastructure for that. I call that kind of compute over data networks. And the other part is just the raw scalability. Like the entire industry right now has been pushing really hard for scalability, and we're now getting to hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of transactions per second. I think we need to hit not billions, but trillions of transactions per second. Start thinking in levels of, all tweets going through some kind of blockchain infrastructure. Like, we need to hit that kind of scalability.
Per second collectively, not on a single instance.
So collectively as the entire industry, but I do think you can get to this kind of level in kind of one tree. So if you think of Ethereum with the set of L2s as starting to form a tree, think of that programmatically being able to expand to be able to deal with the demand of block space. Plus, you need to be able to do clear transactions way faster than kind of the current block time. You need to be able to do operations that are sub-second. So think of traditional data centers, traditional operations. You want to be able to do scalable, high throughput database updates, basically, within a data center at sub-second speeds. Once we can unlock that, then you can get the broad base set of applications rewritten in that Web3 landscape. So like that's kind of the blocker between where we are today and the free internet that we're all working towards, right? So this entire movement started with a goal of building these new primitives, new foundational infrastructure to build a better rights-oriented, human-controlled, human data preserving internet. In order to get there, we need to build that level of scalability so that any developer can target the cloud or can target the Web3 cloud, can target the decentralized cloud. So think about it that way.
I mean, it's a very, I would say, not contradictory. I would say
it's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it plays out.
Yes, contrarian is the word I was looking for. We don't think about everything. I mean, even Web 2 isn't thinking about having databases be optimized for this scale. So that seems like now that you explain it, I feel like, okay, this makes sense. If you're trying to replace something or offer a built alternative, it's got to be at least marginally better, more than marginally better. And in context, this makes a lot of sense. How does computing over data come into play here?
Yeah, so when you think about modern services, some amount of the operation happens in the client side. So think of like in your phone or your browser, some operations happen there. Some operations happen when you submit a request, and there's some little bit of business logic that happens. A lot of that has been now built in kind of blockchain structures today. But a huge fraction of the computation happens machine to machine afterwards. It happens as part of background processing. So think of like if you upload a video to YouTube, YouTube has to like rescale that video. It has to post-process it. It has to apply filtering. It has to figure out the metadata. It has to update a bunch of feeds. It has to push it to all the subscribers. There's an enormous amount of processing that happens behind the scenes. And all of that kind of computing infrastructure today in our industry is still happening in a fully centralized Web 2 context. We need to get all of that kind of stuff to be able to be operating over a normal Web 3 decentralized infrastructure. And so we need to get like the computational primitives to be able to do that kind of processing.
What's missing in that primitive? Is it just having the sheer capacity to set up these pipelines, or are we waiting for something to be invented?
I think one part of it is being able to do kind of like job scheduling, or kind of being able to run kind of what normally would be in like a web server, but as services that are blockchain powered and that nobody runs or controls, that you can kind of run in the network. And that includes a lot of computation, so you can't put it in the modern kind of consensus throughput. You should be able to kind of job schedule through that. So think of like Kubernetes style operation, but over in this kind of decentralized setting. So that's one component. I think a separate component is being able to do just like these large scale data pipelines. So being able to define a job that you want to run over some data, you apply some function over that data, you compute the output, and you kind of feed back the output into the network. So I think those two things are going to, and kind of a broader scalability primitives are going to get built out over the next couple of years.
I think effectively Kubernetes is a pretty good explanation because we know how to visualize that, and you can set up all these nodes and clusters and run arbitrary code. So that actually would be cool. I mean, the more you kind of say it becomes, I mean, it's clicking to me, and it's becoming more obvious that maybe this is one of the reasons we haven't seen a lot of good consumer apps. It's because we get to not fully replace every part of that stack with something that we think is better in terms of decentralization. But what's the prediction on how long it takes us to get to trillions of transactions per second?
Yeah, so I think we'll probably have the proofs of concept of this and the first versions of this kind of architecture live in the next couple of years. And then from there, we'll probably have the first applications that are going to push like all of their operations on top of these things kind of in the year or 2 years after that. So I think that within 3 to 4 years, we might see the first fully native Web3 powered social network or something like that, or game like an MMO or something like that, that can just run completely on decentralized infrastructure. So not next year, not the year after that, but this infrastructure is going to come into play. Then those use cases will appear, and that will push the scalability up. So I think hitting trillions probably 5 or 6 years out, but I think the tech will be there in 2 to 3 years.
Now it's a bold move. Let's see if it plays off.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about a couple of technical things that you think could use improvement. I guess one obvious thing that most people kind of don't realize that a lot of the things that blockchains also enable are just economic benefits in sandboxing. So anything kind of that you think is interesting as a theme that people are not experimenting enough with?
Yeah, so one of the most promising and valuable things of this entire space is the ability to create new funding structures or new governance structures around how humans and groups organize. So this means new kinds of ways of organizing people, organizing groups, and so on. And this is where we have the capability of creating new kinds of structures. So like DAOs are an example of this, but we need many more such mechanisms to do things like way better public funding, public goods funding, or network governance structures that can coordinate us into building way better infrastructure and services and systems for society as a whole. So I realized a couple of years ago that if crypto keeps growing at the trajectory it's had for the last 10 years, and we can get some good public funding primitives into the network, crypto could be funding science at the scale of nation states. So just for everybody's knowledge, like some science funding around the world is kind of spotty. Some countries do a lot more funding than others. The US is one of the countries that funds the most. And usually this gets divided into different agencies around the world. The kind of funding scale is kind of around, in the tens of billions of dollars per year for each of these countries. So you can maybe add all of them up and land on something like $100 to $200 billion a year for all of science funding worldwide. So if you think of like a nation scale, so like single billion or tens of billions per year, crypto could do that. Crypto could actually fund science and R&D at a global scale. We're just missing the right primitives to be able to organize that kind of funding structure. And the long-term feedback loop of showing that impact is returning value back to the entire crypto space so that can create a feedback loop. So that's the kind of thing that I think is extremely exciting about crypto as a whole, like these new kinds of foundational primitives for organizing groups. And all of this kind of within the broader community of public goods funding. So you might have heard from like groups like Gitcoin or Network Goods or Optimism with RetroPGF and so on. So all of these are kind of super interesting experiments for how do we use crypto native primitives to build these new kinds of funding structures. And I think that's one of the most exciting areas of the entire space.
No, I mean, that is actually measurable progress too, because we can unlock so much and you can create these special interests groups that care about specific advancements. Maybe for the hackers too in the audience, is what you said a request for better tools, or we need better economic models?
It's
How
kind
do we
of both.
translate that to actionable things?
So we have a lot of ideas. So maybe 2 years ago, we were missing ideas. And so now there's been a ton of conversation over over a bunch of conferences and prototypes and so on. So we now have reached a point where we need to implement a lot of these ideas and test them. So we need both implementation of these into tools that we can use to run these kinds of protocols, and we need experiments that are actually going to try this and run this and collect data and see how well it works and what are the problems, like what parts does it get right, what parts does it not get right, so we can refine and improve this kind of structure. The really cool thing is like we're now reaching in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars deployed through this kind of public goods funding oriented structures. So things like Gitcoin, things like the Network Goods group, and the RetroPGF in Optimism have together collectively deployed, I think, over $100 million now. And so like, all of that is
more.
Yeah, and probably more. And so all of that is using public goods funding oriented structures. And so think of that as creating a new class of organizational structures that can help us build a better future without having to appeal to like just the traditional private funding routes.
That one makes sense, and I think that's like actually a good way to think about how large groups or even small groups can actually coordinate this. A couple things you said about kind of compute and scalability, are these kind of things that you believe are specific to the Filecoin ecosystem, or kind of what's the context here?
No, this is everywhere. So I think this is for the crypto world as a whole. If we can build these kinds of structures, then the whole world would benefit. And I don't know, like I tend to not see a lot of the ecosystems as kind of as fragmented as maybe most people might perceive. There's a lot of branding from every different group and so on. And so it might feel like
Tribalism.
Yeah, tribal, different communities and so on. But in reality, most of these groups are extremely collaborative. Their shared resources and shared code powers the whole ecosystem. And so there's an enormous amount of collaboration. So as an example, like the IPFS ecosystem, which sort of like includes the Filecoin ecosystem, creates a ton of value for the Ethereum ecosystem. Like Liquid2P, which is something that came out of IPFS, now powers Ethereum 2 and powers Polkadot and powers Celestia and a bunch of other networks. And then even something like Filecoin started as, it's sort of like the OG Ethereum L2, like the early on in 2016.
Wait, what?
Yeah. So we originally wanted to ship Filecoin as an Ethereum, what we called at the time a virtual network on top of Ethereum. So like the concept of L2s wasn't around yet.
What year is this?
This is 2016 or so. Yeah.
Wow.
And so, but we calculated the throughput and block space that Filecoin was going to need, and it was about like 90 to 95% of the entire block space of the Ethereum base layer. So we couldn't do that, and so we had to like then create a separate L1. But now we're seeing all of that reshuffling, and so my prediction is that we'll see lots of chains and lots of systems totally restructure and reshuffle themselves as the developer experience changes, as communities change and evolve and collaborate and so on. Like what we just saw this week, Celo went from an L1 into an Ethereum L2. And so we'll likely see a lot of that kind of thing happening.
And I totally agree. I guess on that theme, okay, so let's say these predictions are good on timelines. In 5 years, we see 1 trillion transactions per second, which means anything you can imagine is possible on chain. How should founders be thinking about building companies? And this is obviously the best time to start.
So I like thinking about this in terms of maybe a set of stages that builders should kind of think about. When you're in a hackathon context, and this is one of the reasons why I love hackathons as much and where you spend so much time and thought working with builders through hackathons. Hackathons give you this great environment where you can learn a ton. You can push your skills, you can explore a bunch of different areas, but you have a limited time to be able to make your thing, complete it, and deliver it to be judged, right? And you have to also get good at presenting it. You have to you have to solve an interesting problem for somebody. You have to learn how to sell it to somebody. And so all of that forces you to go through the entire kind of like product design validation loop in one go, like in a very fast pace. And it teaches you a ton about lots of different things, and you'll get a ton of feedback. So that's kind of an example stage that builders should go through. So when you're first kind of thinking about potential ideas, one part of that is get to being able to build like a minimum version of the product, like a prototype or something like that. Hackathon is a great example for that. It'll force you to start validating your ideas. Now, at some point, you'll find something that you think is compelling and interesting, and you think that it potentially has legs, and you're getting interesting feedback from others that maybe there's something here. Maybe this could turn into a startup of some kind, whether it's a startup company or a startup network or some other kind of project. At that point, what you want to do is refine the idea and look deeper into it. Try to validate it more. Think ahead to what it could turn into. Think about who would the users be, what are the early communities you could work with, and so on. So it's kind of a deeper validation step. And that will start informing what needs to become your first minimum viable product, right? So you go from like early ideas, early prototypes into something that you think will actually work. That's like the keyword there is viable, meaning some product that you can actually create for users and for whom you're solving a problem and for whom are going to then start relying on your thing. Once you have that in place, you have the trajectory for a startup. And again, this could be a startup company, it could be a startup network or a startup open source project or something like that. The mode really depends on what the kind of thing that you're building is. And at that point, you kind of want to start thinking about what's the scale of this thing? How much funding are you going to require to build this? How many other people do you need to work with to organize this? And so for the startup company trajectories, or there's kind of fundraising as an option, or I guess for all three trajectories, there's fundraising. It just changes structure. Like in open source, you're probably raising grant funding. In startups, you're probably raising venture capital or something like that. In crypto networks, you're sort of somewhere in between. And that pushes you into kind of the next stage, which is formulating this as a company or a network or something like that, and then raising capital, going through an accelerator or something like that. So right now, where all the builders here are, I would strongly encourage you to be experimenting with this hackathon and future hackathons to find an idea and get to validating something that could turn into a minimum viable product. You won't get to your full MVP through a hackathon, but you might get to something that'll let you take that next step. And so think about that sort of broader trajectory.
As someone who's kind of been through the traditional funding route and also an interface with the decentralized worlds, any common bad advice that you think is given out for building startups that does not really apply to, bad as in it doesn't apply to Web3 companies?
Yeah, so the traditional startup ecosystem, it has to be extremely competitive and extremely closed and private because the nature of those kinds of products are that all of the IP is very closed and highly proprietary.
More zero-sum.
Very zero-sum oriented. And this whole ecosystem is extremely positive-sum oriented, highly collaborative. Most of what everybody's building is open source. You can take it and fork it and try something else. And so you end up with a much more collaborative environment where all of the groups building, whether it's like L1s or L2s or services or products or whatever, tend to collaborate dramatically more. So one of the big things that I kind of see is you want to coordinate and cooperate as much as you can, and you want to be very open with what you're doing. You want to create a community early on and build a broader community of users, developers, and participants that are going to help your product or your system grow. And that's very different than traditional startups.
Makes sense in hindsight. Well, I want to close off by, in this case, asking the same question you asked me. You've been here in this space for almost a decade, maybe more. Where would you say we're in this space? And I guess zooming out, how do you think we rate ourselves on the progress we've made?
Yeah, so look, I would keep it maybe short and sweet here. I think that this community has built some of the most compelling and important infrastructure for humanity broadly. Especially right now, the finance stack is really solid, but the broader communication stack and the broader internet stack is following. And now that all these primitives are here, you as builders get to shape the next big thing, the next important set of components. So it's really up to you. It's really up to what you want to build, and what you make and what you scale that will define the future. So go make it a good one, and hack on really cool stuff.
Amazing advice. Thank you so much.
Thanks.